Week 4 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. It took a couple weeks for Ja'Marr Chase to get his legs under him. Now coming off 118 yards and 2 touchdown performance versus the Commanders on Monday night in Week 3. This week, a great matchup at the Carolina Panthers, and this is pretty much a must-win game for the Cincinnati Bengal team, 0-3 on the season. And versus a weak secondary, I think Chase goes out there once again, has a big game. Number 2, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb missed all the training camp, got his contract, and so far it's been a mixed bag of results for CeeDee Lamb. Last week, a bad fumble in the red zone, complaining a lot on the sidelines. But I think this week, Thursday night, this Cowboy team knows they need to go into MetLife. They got to play good football, and Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb got to get back on the same page this week with a good matchup and a team where he's had a good track record against in his career. He's CeeDee Lamb. I think he bounces back. Number 3, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Justin Jefferson, he's matchup proof. A lot of people were worried coming into the year if he would put up big numbers with Sam Darnold at quarterback. And so far, Justin Jefferson's putting up the elite numbers, a top wide receiver. And this week at Green Bay, a team he's very familiar with over the years playing within the division, I think once again goes out there for a nice game. Number 4, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. Week 1, it was a bad ball game for St. Brown versus the Rams, but the last 2 weeks he's found the end zone, and we know he's one of the best route runners in the league. We know he's got good hands, and in a potential shootout on Monday night versus Seattle, I think St. Brown once again delivers. Number 5, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Nico Collins, one of the better route runners in the league and one of the up-and-coming wide receivers in the league. Last week, for his standards, it was an off game. Still had 4 catches, 86 yards, and a blowout loss at the Minnesota Vikings. And this week, a great matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, who just got destroyed by the Buffalo Bills on Monday night in Week 3. So I think Nico Collins, it wouldn't be surprising to me if he gets 80 to 100 yards in this one and finds the end zone. Number 6, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. Rashee Rice quickly moving up the rankings over the first 3 weeks of the season. Him and Patrick Mahomes, they're locked in. Number 1 target easily in that offense for Kansas City, with Travis Kelce taking a back seat this season. And Rashee Rice, he's got the speed, he's got the size, he can run the routes. And this week in a matchup of Los Angeles Chargers with Derwin James out, suspended 1 game, I think Rice feasts once again. Number 7, Marvin Harrison, the Arizona Cardinals. Week 1, he didn't do anything as Harrison, but the last 2 weeks he's put up numbers, especially in Week 2 in that blowout victory versus the Los Angeles Rams. He had 130 yards and 2 touchdowns, and last week once again found the end zone in that ball game versus the Lions. So this week, a great matchup, a potential high-scoring game between the Commanders and this Arizona Cardinal team in Arizona once again. And Marvin, he just looks like a number 1 wide receiver, and him and Kyler Murray are building up rapport. Number 8, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants. You want to talk about an impressive rookie, Malik Neighbors. He's going out there and he's taking the league by storm with one of the worst starting quarterbacks in all pro football. And this week, a good matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys. Their secondary's been torched so far in the early going this season. And I think Malik Neighbors, he's matchup proof. And even with a quarterback who's not good, he's going out there and putting up elite numbers, is Malik Neighbors right now. And once again, I think he's a top 10 option. Number 9, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So far, Chris Godwin's outplayed and put up way more points than Mike Evans in the early going. So this week, it's a pretty decent matchup versus Philadelphia Eagles, even though the Eagles last week shut down that New Orleans Saints offense. Chris Godwin, we know he's got good hands. We know he's one of the best route runners and slot receivers in the league. And this season, where he's been in the slot once again way more like he was previous seasons, it's working out big time, and him and Baker Mayfield are connecting weekly. Number 10, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Metcalf off to a monster start for back-to-back games, over 100 yards and a touchdown in each performance. This week, a good matchup in a potential shootout on Monday night at the Detroit Lions. DK Metcalf, we know he's a matchup nightmare. We know he's got that breakaway speed and a good route runner. And in this new offensive system this season, it's definitely paying good dividends for DK Metcalf. And once again, it will this week, I believe. Number 11, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. He's definitely dropping down the rankings over the last couple weeks here. Is Hill with 2 out with injury, minimum another 3-4 weeks for this Dolphin team. Now it looks like Tim Boyle is going to be the starter in this one Monday night versus Tennessee. But Tyreek Hill, I've said it in other videos, it just takes 1 or 2 deep balls for him to really have a ball game, and that's what hopefully this Dolphin team's banking on to get points on the board and what fantasy owners are, because last week he was bottled up and nothing was going. 3 catches, 40 yards, number 12, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So, yes, I don't know if Devonta Smith's going to play in this game. He's coming off a concussion after taking a monster hit in the Week 3 victory at the New Orleans Saints. And this week, it's a good matchup at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If somehow he passes the concussion protocol and could play in Sunday's ball game at Tampa Bay. So, he's on this list. Obviously, is Devonta Smith. And if he don't play, you just scratch him off and go, as the rankings go on, number 13, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So Drake London starting to get things going over the last 2 weeks. 2 touchdowns in the last 2 games. He's a big wide receiver. He was one of the top prospects to come out of college in the last few seasons at the position. And Kirk Cousins, he's starting to feel it a little bit and get the football to Drake London, get it to Kyle Pitts. And Darnell Mooney's really emerged as well over the last 2 weeks for this Atlanta Falcon team. So this week in a potential high-scoring game with division rival the New Orleans Saints, I like London once again to have a solid performance. 14, Chris Olave staying in the same game of the New Orleans Saints. So Olave, first 2 weeks of the season, got off to a slow start. They scored 91 points in those 2 games, was New Orleans, go figure. And then last week, they were held down to 1 touchdown in that game versus the Philadelphia Eagles, where Chris Olave caught a nice ball in the back of the end zone. So this week, good matchup with the Atlanta Falcons. We just saw Rashee Rice come off a monster game at them indoors in Atlanta, and I think Chris Olave and Carr are back on the same track, and he has a good ball game this week. 15, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I know the last 2 weeks Mike Evans has really struggled for this Buc team and fantasy owners, but Evans, he's always been a better player at home, and last week with Patrick Surtain on him a majority of the game, he's one of the tougher matchups in the league and best corners in the league. So this week versus Philadelphia, I think he bounces back. Chris Olave, who I just mentioned, had a great game versus the Eagles, and I think Mike Evans and Chris Godwin both have solid performances. 16, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. So I mentioned Surtain, and once again this week, Surtain's going to be covering Garrett Wilson, I assume, a majority of this ball game. So Garrett Wilson so far, his numbers have been underwhelming for someone who went in the first round, second round of most fantasy drafts. Him and Rodgers are still trying to get on the same track for this New York Jet team. And Garrett Wilson's a great talent. Last season, with no quarterback play, with Zach Wilson and Tim Boyle, he went over 1,000 yards. But this week, he's down in the rankings with the tough matchup. I still believe he could carve out wide receiver 2 numbers. 17, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. Last week, his best game of the season with 15 fantasy points in PPR leagues for DJ Moore. So we know he's a good route runner. We know he's got great yard after catch prowess, but him and Caleb Williams really haven't been on the same page. And Caleb Williams last week was his best game of the season. McCall Kmet really got most of the work and put up the big numbers. Him and Rome Odunze, with DJ Moore being in third in numbers last week, but this week in a good matchup versus the Rams, who just got torched by Jawan Jennings for 11 catches, 175 yards, and 3 touchdowns. I think Moore goes out there and has a good performance. 18, Devontae Adams of the Vegas Raiders. Adams, it's going to be up and down games all season with Gardner Minshew at the quarterback position, and also with Brock Bowers getting a decent target share in this offense. So Adams this week, he's going to most likely draw majority of the game. Denzel Ward, one of the better corners in the league, covering him. But I don't think it's a problem. Devontae Adams, he's been better at home in his Vegas Raider career for the most part than he's been on the road. I know the numbers are going to be declining at 32 years old, not playing with a good quarterback really in Gardner Minshew. But this week versus Cleveland, I think he's a number 2 option wide receiver for fantasy owners. 19, Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. So Diggs, first 2 out of 3 games, he's looked good for this Texan team. Last week, they got the doors blown off 34-7, but 10 receptions in that ball game for Stephon Diggs. And this week, a great matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars coming to town, where they can't stop anyone. And we just saw Buffalo go up and down the field, scoring over 45 points in that game. So Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, I expect nice weeks from both of them. Once again, number 20, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So people figured with George Kittle out, obviously, and also with Deebo Samuel out a few weeks, that Ayuk last week, he was going to have a monster performance. The one thing that did happen for Ayuk, he did have 10 targets, and he's another guy like Jamar Chase and CeeDee Lamb pretty much didn't play all training camp or preseason, still getting his legs under him. And this week in a favorable matchup versus the New England Patriots, I think he could go out there and have his best game of the season. 21, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. He's the number one target in this passing game, easily as Zay Flowers. Mark Andrews, he's done nothing so far the first 3 weeks of the season. Isaiah Likely, besides that one pop game in week one, he's been quiet the last couple weeks. And this week, a decent matchup versus the Buffalo Bills, where their secondary's got a lot of moving parts and young players with a whole defensive turnover over the last offseason. But this is going to be a high-scoring game, I believe, between these two teams. And like I said, Zay Flowers is the number one target in this Raven offense. And he's another play. If he gets in open field, watch out, 22 Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. Amari Cooper, we know he's one of the better route runners in the league still, but he's another player declining as age, and that's just normal for wide receivers. Once they hit that 31, 32-year-old age, their numbers start to go down. So Amari Cooper last week had a monster game, had over 25 fantasy points in PPR leagues, found the end zone twice versus the New York Giants. And this week, a good matchup on paper at the Vegas Raiders, where Deontay Johnson just went off for 120 yards and a touchdown in that game. So Cooper, him and Watson haven't been on the same page, but this week, I think he could go out there and have a good game. 23 to mention Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. So this week, a pretty good matchup versus the Cincinnati Bengals that just got wrecked by the Washington Commanders, giving up 38 points in that game. So Deontay Johnson, when he has a capable quarterback, we see what he could do with Ben Roethlisberger a few seasons ago. And then it's been a quarterback carousel in Pittsburgh the last few seasons. And now with Andy Dalton under center for this Carolina Panther team, him and Dalton had a good connection. Now Adam Thielen on IR, that's a few more targets that could open up. And this week versus Cincinnati, I think it's safe to put Johnson back in your lineup. 24, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, number one option on the offense. Him and Fields are starting to build a rapport. And Fields, he's not running as much, especially the last 2 weeks here, where he's been more of a pocket passer, and he's targeting Pickens a whole lot. So this week in the middle of the pack matchup at the Indianapolis Colts, if Fields and Pickens just connect on a deep ball, which they're just missing on over the last few weeks, we could see a big game from Pickens this week. 5, Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. And Jameson Williams, I've mentioned this in other videos as well. He's going to be a boom or bust wide receiver. Devonta Smith kind of, where there's weeks he's going to put up the monster numbers and weeks where he takes a back seat to Amon-Ra St. Brown and doesn't do much. And we've seen it so far this year. Week 1, monster game, 120 yards. Found the end zone in that one versus the Rams. Week 2, another solid performance. 5 catches, 79 yards in that ball game versus Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And then last week, 1 catch for 9 yards at the Cardinals. So this week versus Seattle coming to town, I think Jameson Williams, he's going to be a player that's better at home than he is on the road. Indoors in Detroit. So this week versus Seattle on Monday night, I think he bounces back. 26, Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. Jayden Reed, I believe, bounces back after his numbers have been mediocre the last 2 games. We saw the damage he did week 1 versus the Eagles in London. And now with Jordan Love most likely coming back to the lineup this week, where he was close to playing last week, warming up on the field, practice with pads. I believe he returns this week in a big division matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings. And I know they're one of the better defenses in the league so far in the early going. But I think Reed's a solid back into flex option. 27, Jawan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. What a ball game. And a game we might not see from anyone the rest of the year. 11 catches, 175 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He's got to be owned everywhere. Is Jawan Jennings. Him and Brock Purdy have a great rapport working with the second team a couple seasons ago before Purdy was the starting quarterback. And this week in a good matchup versus the New England Patriots. I think Jennings could have a good game, but I don't think he'll ever come close to what he did last week. 28, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. Shakir looks easily like the number 1 wide receiver target on this offense, with him and Dalton Kincaid being the 2 top options in the passing game. And this week, a middle of the pack matchup at the Baltimore Ravens. So this Raven team, you could throw the football on them. We saw Adams in week 2 have a big ball game. We saw Rashee Rice week 1 have a big ball game. And last week, the Cowboys got up and down the field towards the end of the game. I know it was some garbage time, but they made it easy at times as well. So I think the secondary isn't all that great so far this season. And Shakir and Josh Allen, they're on the same wavelength. They're making plays. 29, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. Higgins, last week, he could have had a big game, but his foot was out of bounds in the end zone on one play. Then another big catch he couldn't stay in bounds on. And this week, it's a good matchup at the Panthers, that their secondary can't stop anyone. And this is a must-win ball game for Cincinnati, because if they fall to 0-4, you know how it goes. Your season's pretty much over. So T. Higgins working his way back in the lineup. Favorable matchup. He was unscathed at least and looked healthy coming out of last week's ball game. And I like him this week as a flex option, number 3 receiver, 30, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. Scary Terry finally had that big game last week, a big 55-yard catch early in that game, and then a big 20-yard touchdown towards the end to put the game on ice with a few minutes left in that one. Him and Jaden Daniels are starting to get a rapport. They know they need patience. They talked about it after the game, after the upset victory at Cincinnati, and this week in a potential shootout at Arizona where their secondary isn't all that great. I think Terry McLaurin can have a decent game. 31, Jalen Waddle at the Miami Dolphins. He's definitely free-falling down the rankings the last couple weeks here is Waddle. And without Tua, we've seen it. The games 2 years ago when he missed time with concussions. Jalen Waddle didn't really do much, so Tyreek Hill and Devon Achane, the only players on this Dolphin team that I would have confidence in starting each and every week. So Waddle, like I said, falling down the rankings. Not a great matchup. Not a good quarterback behind center in Boyle or Thompson in this one. So Waddle, he's at the back end of this list. 32, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. Odunze at his coming out party. First career touchdown last week. Big ball game. Put up his best game of his career, obviously, in week 3 at the Indianapolis Colts. And this week, a beatable matchup once again versus the Los Angeles Rams coming to Soldier Field, where we just saw Juwan Jennings go off for a monster game, 175 and 3 TDs. But the only thing Keenan Allen possibly could return in this game, he's going to take targets away from Odunze, and also Cole Kmet re-emerging in this offense and getting all the tight end snaps for the most part. He's going to take targets his way, but Odunze as a number 3 flex option, I like him. And if he has another breakout game this week, he'll move up these rankings. 33, Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints. Shaheed, 2 big weeks, week 1 and week 2. The deep ball, obviously, has been Shaheed's specialty throughout his NFL career. And then, of course, when most fantasy owners picked him up and put him in the starting lineup, last week he had a goose egg, even though him and Derek Carr just missed on 2 deep balls in the end zone. So this week, a beatable matchup at Atlanta. Rashee Rice just came off a monster game at the Falcons, and this could potentially be a shootout between 2 division rivals. 34, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. I like the way Thomas has played the first 3 games of his NFL career. Last week, I know Christian Kirk was the leading wide receiver, but that ball game was over at halftime between the Bills and the Jaguars. And this week, I think they're going to be throwing a lot more as well is this Jacksonville Jaguar team, where they're going to Houston, and Houston coming off a blowout loss at Minnesota. Want to go out there, Houston, and put points on the board quickly. And this week here, Brian Thomas, a lot of garbage time points I could see. And he's been solid so far in the early going. 35, staying in the same game. Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. So Dell, it's been a struggle so far in the early going. And obviously he's the number 3 wideout behind Collins and Stephon Diggs for this Houston Texan team. But last week he had a double-digit fantasy game, over 11 points in PPR leagues. And he's banged up a little bit with soreness. But I believe he could have a breakout game versus Jaguar team where their secondary can't stop anyone. They're giving up a lot of points, especially last week, over 45 to the Buffalo Bills. So Tank Dell is a flex option I would be comfortable with. And the 36th and final wide receivers, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. It's going to be an up and down, inconsistent year, I believe, for Jackson Smith. But we know the potential's there. We saw week 2, 11 catches, over 100 yards on a whopping 16 targets at the Patriots. And then last week, a quiet ball game, only 3 catches, 36 yards in the victory versus the Dolphins. So like I said, a lot of mouths to feed on this offense. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. And at this point, Jackson Smith-Njigba shouldn't be a receiver that you're going to be so high on. He's just more of a boom or bust play. That's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 4 of the fantasy football season.